Today I thought it would be a cool tutorial to basically try and build the TikTok button using frame of motion in React. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so I've used Create React App to put together a really basic project using the TypeScript template. All it's got inside of it at the moment is a container with a bunch of styles attached to it. Nothing particularly exciting, just a div that ultimately fills the screen. And inside of that, I've got a component called Record Button, which is exported from the Record Button file over here. The Record Button file at the moment doesn't have a whole lot in it. We've got a declaration of our red color at the top because we're going to be using that a lot, and then underneath that I've just put together some really basic layout styles for all of our containers that we're going to be adding to this over the course of the tutorial. If you need these files though, they are going to be available on my website, so have a look below for that kind of information if you need it. Okay, to get started, I'm just going to put together our elements. So we're going to have a container which is going to house both of our circles. So that's just going to have our styles.container styles applied to it. And inside of that, we want to add two animated divs effectively. At this point, we're going to start using Framer to put together some animated divs. So if you don't have it installed in your project already, you can just use yarn or npm and add the Framer motion package. I've already got it installed in this project, so I'm just going to go ahead and import it at the top of my file. So import motion from Framer motion. While I'm here, I'm also going to import React as well to stop ESLint complaining. Next up, I'm going to initialize both of our divs. So if I refer back to our QuickTime player, or rather to our reference, we can see that we've got these two separate circles. We've got one in the middle, which is going to animate separately to the outer circle. So we're going to basically create both of those first. So to do that, inside of our container, I'm going to add motion.div, and for the time being we'll just close that, and as a sibling we'll also have motion.div as well. Next up, let's add some basic styles to it. So I've already written the circles, some styles for the circle ahead of time, so I'm just going to attach those. So style, and we're going to spread out the base circle styles, which is going to apply to both of our circles, and then we're going to apply the outer circle styles to this one, and then on the one below it we're going to apply the global styles once again, and then we're also going to apply the inner circle styles. So the way we're going to approach this is we're going to handle the animation states of each circle independently, and then we'll join them all together at the end. So let's start with the inner circles. So you can see that it starts as a full circle, and then our second state is it turns into a square and it becomes slightly smaller. And then the third state is it just disappears altogether. And then when we let go of the button, it comes back to the way it was at the very beginning. So we've got three different states there. We've got an initial one, we've got a square state, and then we've got, I guess, invisible. So let's create those variants to get started. So let's declare the inner circles variants to get started. So I'm going to, outside of our record button component, I'm going to declare a new constant. It's going to be called inner circle variants. And I'm also going to give it the type variants from the frame of motion package. That's just going to ensure that everything is type checked as we go along. And like I said, we've got three different states. So we start with our initial state, which I guess is a circle. Then it becomes a square, and then it becomes invisible. So let's go circle, square, invisible. So those are going to be our three state variants for our inner circle. Let's handle the scale of our inner circle first. So at the very beginning, we're kind of a default state, which I guess we'll just call 100%. Then it turns into a slightly smaller shape. So I would say maybe about 80% the size it was. And then finally, it scales down to nothing. So I guess our three states are going to be 100%, 80%, and then 0%. So let's add those into our variant states. So at the circle state, which is the beginning, we're going to set our transform to be scale 1. Then for our square, we're going to set it to scale 0.8, which is 80% of the size that it was at the beginning. And then when it's invisible, of course, it's just going to be scale 0 because it doesn't exist anymore. The only other thing that animates on our inner circle is the border radius. It starts at 100%, which basically gives it that sort of circle look. Then the border radius then sort of like falls down to maybe about 20%, maybe 30%, so that we kind of get what looks like just like a rounded square. And then it goes back to, you can kind of see as it gets smaller, it's very, very, very subtle. It's very, very, very subtle. But it actually goes back to being a circle again at the very end. So our border radius is going to go 100%, 30% when it's a square, and then 100% once again once it shrinks down. So let's add those back in. So border radius is going to be 100% at the very beginning to give us that circle look. Then the border radius is going to become 30% to give it that square look. And then finally, the border radius is going to become 100% one last time when it turns invisible. So now we need to add a state to be able to identify when our record button is being hovered over. That's going to influence when we play each one of the states of our different circles. So to do that, I'm just going to declare a new state called hover and set hover. I'm just going to import the useState hook from React, and that's going to be a Boolean, and to begin with it's going to be set to false. Next up, on the outer container, I'm just going to add on mouse enter, and inside of that I'm going to set our hover state to true when our mouse goes over it, and I'm going to add the on mouse leave event, and again do the same thing, set our hover state to false. That means that when we hover over our outer container, the hover state will be set to true, and when our cursor leaves that div, it will set the hover state to false. So next we're going to need to create a reference to our inner circles animation. And the way that we're going to do that is by using a hook from Frame of Motion called use animation. So I'm just going to import it from the Frame of Motion package. And then just below our hover state, I'm going to create a new constant called inner circle animation. And then I'm just going to call our use animation hook. Next up, we want our inner circle to be able to react to the hover state. So when our hover state changes to true, we want our inner circle to turn into a square and then to disappear altogether. And if our hover state is set to false, then we want our inner circle to return to its original state. So to do that, we're going to import the use effect hook from React, and we're going to initialize a new hook and listen to that hover state. So to do that, I'm just going to import use effect from React, and then just below our inner circle animation, I'm going to declare a new use effect, and inside our dependencies array, I'm just going to add hover, and that's all I need to do for the time being. So next up, I actually want to use some asynchronous logic. I want to wait for our animation state to go from its initial state, which is a circle, into a square, and then want to wait until it's turned into a square before then shrinking it down and turning into the invisible state. The issue that we have here is that use effects don't actually allow us to pass in an asynchronous function to them. If I try, we can see that I get a red underline over it, and it says that effect callbacks are synchronous to prevent race conditions. So inside of our use effect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new asynchronous function so that we can have that async functionality inside of a use effect. So to resolve that, I'm just going to create a new asynchronous function inside of our use effect, and I'm just going to run it straight away. So to do that, I'm going to create our async function and then just initialize it right away. And so inside of that asynchronous function, if we are hovering over our record button, let's change it into a square and then change the state to invisible. So to do that, I'm just going to check to see if we are hovering over it, and if we are, then I'm going to await our inner circle animation, and I'm going to ask it to play the square variant. And then immediately after that, I want it to, once it's finished playing the square variant, I want it to play the invisible variant. That means that when we hover over it, it will go from whatever it currently is, which will be its initial state, which is going to be circle. So it'll go from circle to square to invisible, but it will wait for the square animation to finish before it plays the invisible state. If we aren't hovering over it, then we simply just want to play one animation. We want it to go straight back to where it started, so back to the circle animation. So I'm going to add just an else statement here. I'm just going to do the same thing. and play the circle variant. Brilliant. Now that we've defined our inner circle's variance and we've also defined the animation, let's actually bind that to our motion div. So to do that, I'm just going to add the animate parameter, and I'm going to pass in our inner circle animation there. And then I'm also going to pass in our variance as the inner circle variance there, and just hit save. So if we head back over to our app now, we can see that we've got our inner circle just in the middle of the screen. If we hover over it, we should see it change from a circle to a square to then be invisible. And then when we move out of our record button, or when our cursor moves out of our record button, it should go back to the state that we're looking at right now. So let's see if that works. So, yep. And then if I hover out, it comes back again. So that is working exactly as we expect. So as far as I'm concerned, the inner circle is done, and we can now start work on the outer circle. Okay, so going back to our reference video, so we can see that our outer circle starts with an opacity of maybe 50%. Then our second state for our circle, the circle grows to about twice the size, but stays about 50% opacity. And then once the square disappears, the opacity of the circle then becomes 100%, and it begins sort of scaling up and down, or rather pulsing up and down. So the border width essentially is growing up and down. So let's tackle each one of those steps one by one by creating some new variants for each one of those states. So just like before, I'm going to go outside of our record button function, and I'm going to declare some outer circle variants this time. And I'm going to specify the type is variance, just like we did before. And now it's time to name the 4 different states that we've got. So we've got the original circle, we've got a larger circle, and then we've got almost like a pulsing in. So it kind of, that's where our border grows. And then we've got pulse out, where it goes back to the state that it was beforehand. So let's call it all of those. So let's go circle, large circle, pulse in, and pulse out. Let's start with the size first, because that's nice and easy. So our circle state, which is our first state, is going to be, let's say, 100% in terms of size. The second state, which is a large circle, it kind of grows to maybe twice the size. So for that, it's going to be 200%. For pulse in, it stays the same size, and for pulse out, it also stays the same size. So let's fill those in. So for our circle, we're going to set the transform to a scale of 1. For the large circle, we're going to set our scale to 2. And then for pulse in, we'll set our scale back to 2 again, because we want it to stay large. And for pulse out, we also want it to stay large. We only want it to go back to that smaller size. When we let go of the button, it goes back to its original state. Next up, let's tackle the opacity of it. So it starts at around 50%. So we'll set that to 0.5 for the circle. Then the large circle, it becomes 100%. And for pulse in and pulse out, it remains 100%. So that should be nice and easy to add in. So the opacity for our outer circle is going to be 0.5 at the beginning. Then when it becomes a large circle, it becomes 100% opaque. And then throughout the pulse in and pulse out states, it remains at 100%, only going back to 50% opaque when it shrinks back down. Finally, we have the somewhat complex issue of the pulsing border. Now, I spent a bit of time trying to figure out what the best way was to handle this. And immediately I thought that animating the border width would be the best way, because you could set a border at the beginning, maybe scale it to twice the size, and then go back down again. The issue is the way, or at least with my experience with Framer, I couldn't actually get the border width to animate. So I had to go about it in a different way. And the way that I found to be pretty successful was to actually create a box shadow and animate that. So that's what we're going to be doing. So instead of using a traditional border outline to be able to grow and shrink that border, we're actually just going to use a shadow instead. But the shadow is going to have 0 spread. So it will just look like an outline anyway. So let's add that in. So let's add a 10 pixel box shadow to our original circle and its initial state. So box shadow is going to be set to 0 pixels, So 10 pixels there, and the color is going to be that red color that we defined at the very beginning. I'm just going to copy that. For the large circle, it stays the same size, so it stays that 10 pixel size. And then when it pulses in, we know that from the reference video that it sort of grows to maybe twice its size. So at that point, we're going to set it to 20 pixels. So let's see how that looks. And then when it pulses back out again, we want it to go back to 10 pixels again. So let's go ahead and copy that in. And I think that's all of the properties that we need to set for our outer circle. So we can go ahead and follow that same pattern that we did for the inner circle, add our animation reference, and then apply it to our motion div to animate it at the same time. So just like before, I'm going to create myself a new animation reference. This one's going to be called the outer circle animation. And we're going to once again use that use animation hook from frame of motion. We're also going to create ourselves a separate use effect. This one is going to be specifically for our outer circle so that both effects fire in unison. And just like before, we want an anonymous asynchronous function here so that we can sequence the different animations as we go. So I've created our asynchronous function here, and I'm just going to execute it as soon as our use effect is called. And finally, I just need to add the hover state inside of the dependencies array, and we should be good to write our animation logic. So if we are hovering over our record button, we want to go to our large circle state. So I'm going to go await our outer circle animation and play the large circle state. From there, we actually want to go back and forward between our pulse in and pulse out states repeated until our user moves away from the record button. So to do that, we just go ahead and await outer circle animation just like we did before. But this time we are going to pass in an array of the animation states that we want to go back and forward from. So that is going to be pulse out and then pulse in. And finally, we add an options parameter as our second argument. And we're going to pass in two parameters inside of this options object. The first one's going to be repeat, and we're going to set that to infinity. That is the amount of times that we want this animation to repeat, and we want it to repeat until our user moves their cursor away from the button. And then we want to set our repeat type to mirror. That effectively means that it will go from pulse out to pulse in, then pulse in to pulse out. And finally, to wrap up our animation state, if we are not hovering over our record button, then we want our outer circle animation to go back to its original state, which is called circle. So let's go ahead and set our outer circle animation state to circle. Finally, just like before, let's go ahead and bind that to our outer circle div. And so to do that, we can just pass in animate outer circle animation. So we're passing our outer circle animation to the animate prop, and then we're going to pass our variance in to our variance prop. Next up, let's have a look and see how that is looking. That looks closer to what we were looking for, and if I hover over it, we get the animation that we were expecting. And that pulse in and pulse out effect is going to happen for as long as we are hovered over the record button. When we move our cursor out of the record button, everything falls back to its original state, which is perfect. It's almost exactly what we're looking for. The only thing I've noticed is if I refresh the page, we can see that for a split second, the border radii for both the outer and the inner circle isn't correct. And that's because at the very, very beginning, we haven't actually set an initial state. Our circles don't actually know what state to be at the very beginning. That's very, very easily solved. We can just head straight back over to our record button and set the initial variant state for each of our outer circle and inner circle so that our elements know which state to be when they are first rendered. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and pass in the initial prop. For our outer circle animation, that's going to be circle because that is the first variant that we want it to be. And for our inner circle, we also want our initial property to be circle. Because once again, like I said, we've also named our first state to be circle. And so if I hit save here, head back over to our application and hit refresh, we can see that we haven't got that weird sort of like border radius effect, and everything works exactly as we expect. And I think that's everything. It's quite a complex animation when it's looked at under a microscope, but when you're sort of just using the TikTok app on a daily basis, you probably don't even notice it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was really helpful. If it was, please like and leave a comment on the video. It's the only way that YouTube knows that my channel even exists, so I'd really appreciate it. And also, you doing that also encourages me to basically make more of these kinds of videos, because I know it's the kind of content that you're interested in. So yeah, thanks for following along. If you want the project files, then they are going to be just below. If you're browsing this on my website, codesnap.io, then there'll just be a button just below this video, which will give you everything that you need to be able to download the project files. If you're watching this on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description, which will take you to the project files if you need them. Hopefully that's everything. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and cheers.